you're 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 gonna watch this video and you're gonna like it, and you're gonna subscribe, and you're gonna comment, and okay, that's enough. This week we're gonna talk about The Dead Zone by Stephen King. I swear I will not turn this into a Stephen King channel. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but my library got me the audiobook read by James Franco, of all people, way earlier than I thought it was going to. So I had to take the advantage of listening and reading and getting that one knocked off my constant reader list. So let's talk about The Dead Zone. The funny thing about The Dead Zone is that it's one of the big King standby classics right there with It and The Stand and Misery that I think have entered the popular consciousness. But it was also something that just kind of skirted over my own awareness for so long. My first, I guess, introduction to the concept was in the SNL parody with Christopher Walken that I guess came out a few years after the Cronenberg movie. I didn't see the Cronenberg film until a few years ago myself during the Halloween season, and it's very good. I think it's one of the better King adaptations, probably a top tenner, if I have to say, and maybe that'll be a video I do someday if I do some more King content. And it's interesting to see how Cronenberg creatively sort of edited the source material after you've read it to get a sense of how that story was best honed for the 90-minute runtime. And I will say, after having read The Dead Zone, I do agree with some of those choices. I think the book, by and large, is solid, if maybe a little unspectacular. I've now read all of King's work from his early period, from Carrie now to The Dead Zone, kind of in chronological order. And while I don't think it's my least favorite, it's definitely in the bottom tier, right there with The Stand, unfortunately, which is something that please don't ask me to defend or get into right now. But The Dead Zone, let's talk about it in depth and let's talk about the plot a little. So The Dead Zone came out in 1979. It was probably written a few years before then, given King's general level of productivity and the lead time that's needed between the manuscript stage and the publication stage. But it's mostly hailed now as being sort of an augur for the current political moment, and I can see that a little bit. Though I think it's not quite as nuanced as one might think it needs to be in order to better capture some of the discussion there. But I'll get to that in a second. So the main character, Johnny Smith, he's in a traumatic car accident right after going on a county fair date with his then girlfriend, Sarah. He's put into a coma. He's in this coma for 4 years in Rip Van Winkle style. He wakes up and he learns that not only is his girlfriend married and has children, not only has he learned that the president is different, Richard Nixon has resigned, because this is obviously set in present day, and also that his mother is now a religious Bible thumper, and his father is miserable. So these are all things that have completely wrecked and changed Johnny's world. But the biggest thing is that whenever he comes into contact with someone, he has psychic flashes about what is immediately in their future or what is even potentially deeper into their future. This, of course, eventually creates some level of fame for Johnny, which kind of comes and goes and then comes and goes dependent upon the situation. The book also in parallel has the story of a fellow named Greg Stilson. Now, Stilson's a nasty piece of work. He's the first character you meet in the book before you even meet Johnny and Sarah. And Greg is a Bible salesman who is attempting to become a mover and a shaker of some sort and gain some level of upward mobility in the world. He eventually becomes the mayor of a town, and then he eventually runs for Congress. And his journey is something that will collide with Johnny's. It just takes a while to get there. So let's talk about what I liked best about the book first, and then we can talk about the negatives. For me, this is a book where, as the meme said, he had me in the second half, I'm not gonna lie. that's where the book really takes off. I think once you get through all of the preamble and sort of the King romance stuff and a lot of the things that I think are not King's strong suits, and you get to what the story that King actually wants to tell, the Dead Zone really begins to sing and hum. And I think its dive into the political system of the late 1970s, which sort of saw the realignment of the two-party system into more of the culturally divisive lines that were starting that began then, that we see come to full fruition in the early 2000s, 2010s, and now we have the polarization we have today. Obviously, in the late 70s, the political parties were completely different. There were times when Republicans would win California and Democrats would win the South. I mean, these things can still happen, but the parties were very different. The parties of Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy were very different from the parties of Trump and Harris today. So that's pretty fascinating. And I think it's also interesting to get a sense of what politics are like in Maine specifically. And King does a really nice job painting those pictures, especially in between chapters. And so what King also does is that he centers a little bit of background on Maine's own independent streak too, which I think is really, really kind of unique, because if you look at Maine right now, you have senators like Susan Collins, who's a Republican, and then you have a senator like Angus King, who is a independent who caucuses with the Democrats. Maine has a furiously independent streak, and he dials into that pretty significantly with the character of Greg Stilson. What I really enjoy about that, and this gets back to sort of the outsider in the political system predictive nature of the book, is that Stilson's rise as a potential, well, he does become a member of Congress, but he was a congressional candidate, then he becomes a member of Congress. Spoiler alert, sorry. His rise is predicated on the idea that he is an outsider to the system. He's not a Democrat, he's not a Republican. But King also does hold some level of criticism for that, because he doesn't know anything about politics and he has a lot of stupid ideas, and he kind of makes a clown of himself putting on this construction hat and is running around on stage, doing the I'm gonna tear through Washington kind of bit. So that, I think that is where sort of the comparisons between the current moment we're in today and the book, I think, have the most merit. I don't necessarily know that the nuances are all correct, but I mean, how can you expect a guy who was writing this book in the late 70s to be able to do that anyway? But I do think he had his finger on the pulse on the independent streak of the American voter, especially when you look at people like Ross Perot and Jesse Ventura and other people who have run for office, either unsuccessfully or successfully, and have made headway leading to kind of where we are now. I also enjoy the fact that the Dead Zone is in its own way kind of I guess an inverse, you would say, of 11/22/63, which actually is one of my favorite King books. It's probably in my top 5 right now. If you've ever listened to the King cast, they had Matt Fraction on at one point, I think, to discuss The Wastelands. And within that discussion, they talked a little bit about the fact that there's really only 2 major pop cultural time travel plots that everyone has to write at some point. One is, I'm gonna save Kennedy. The other is, I'm gonna kill Hitler. And so that latter bit is King taking that on now. I think it works. I think, especially as the action comes to a head, that's when the book is at its best. I think the sequences where Smith, Johnny, is working towards planning his attempted assassination of Stilson is very much where the book is at its best. I think all of the sort of his obsession with presidential politics is where the book is at its best, or maybe that's just my own interests. The thing is, 11/22/63, while I have some qualms with its romantic sections as well, I really don't think that's King's strong suit as a writer. I think it's where he falls apart even in his best books. But here, it's really weak. And 11/22/63, it at least ends on a beautiful grace note that I think at least acts as a recovery mechanism for a lot of the stuff that may not work beforehand. But here, there's just no flesh on the bone at all. And we're supposed to, by the end of the book, feel some level of remorse for the character of Sarah. But in truth, she barely knew this guy. And she's married and she has kids with another man, and she's been married for years. It just doesn't pass the smell test. But a lot of the other stuff around it in the back half is great. And beyond the fact that I think Sarah is kind of a cipher of a character, there's also just the issue that so much of the first half of The Dead Zone is very episodic and quite draggy at points. There are moments that are quite exciting. For example, we get the first introduction to the city of Castle Rock, which will become an ongoing fictional playground for King, which I'm excited to read more about because a lot of the Castle Rock books beyond The Dead Zone I have not read. So I'm looking forward to looking into Cujo and Needful Things and some of those other stories. But it still drags. It's still a little episodic, and it feels weightless at times. Even the introduction of Castle Rock doesn't add much to the story. We don't learn a lot about Castle Rock. It's just another city. And the serial killer, the investigation is just, it's fine. It's okay. And it just kind of solves itself in sort of a, I think, unsatisfactory manner. And I would also just say that on the half that makes the book at its weakest, the Greg Stilson character, I really would have liked to spend just a little more time with his buildup, because he is the antagonist of the book. And the book starts really well with him, especially in this scene where he kicks a dog practically to death. And we get a sense of like, yes, he's a real asshole, But we don't learn enough about him throughout the course of his eventual run for Congress. We only get a couple of other scenes, and it's always just him behind a desk, him bullying somebody, him sort of throwing his weight around. But that's kind of all we get. We don't actually know him as a person other than through Johnny's POV. Now, one might say that that is a clever way, and I would probably say this too, that it's a clever way to set up the idea of, what is the background of a potential presidential assassination or an assassin? And like, what has brought them to this point? Well, in Stephen King land, it's being able to see the future, right? But I still wish we could have gotten just a little bit more about Stilson to make him more of a three-dimensional character. And I don't know, Johnny's parents, it's fine. I mean, I think his mother's a caricature, but sometimes King writes parents as caricatures, especially when they're either hypochondriacs or religious fundamentalists. And it's a little cartoonish maybe, which I think weakens the first half significantly. But boy, that second half, very good. So those are my thoughts about The Dead Zone. I will say the audiobook too is not bad. James Franco does a pretty good job. His presentation reminds me a bit of Rod Serling as he's reading it, and I don't know if that was intentional or not. Though I will say, when he plays the doctor, this neurologist that are overseeing Johnny's care, he sounds quite a bit like his Tommy Wiseau impersonation. And I could not get that out of my mind anytime I was listening to it. But otherwise, not bad. I mean, there are better King narrators, but I've also heard much, much worse. So good job, James, wherever you are. Anyway, that's The Dead Zone. Pretty good. I'd give it, on a 5-star rating scale, I don't know, 3 stars, probably. Anyway, see you next time. It won't be Stephen King, I promise. Next week, we'll talk about something else. Anyway, thanks for joining. Like, subscribe, comment. Bye-bye.